Millionaire took his mistress on a Babymoon meant for his pregnant wife. The wife took his empire. Instead, they say some secrets are too ugly to stay hidden, and for millionaire businessman Marcus Donovan, that secret was about to explode in the middle of a picture-perfect life with his pregnant wife. Eleanor rumors started swirling. Another woman. Juliana was seen on a luxurious Babymoon trip in the Mediterranean. But it was no innocent coincidence. That trip had been planned for Eleanor. If only she knew how her world was about to change forever, or how she would rise like a phoenix from the ashes of betrayal to snatch the empire that Marcus believed was his alone. This is a twisted tale of karma's grand design. From the outside looking in, Marcus Donovan appeared to have every advantage. Born into a modest but loving family in the suburbs of Baltimore, he was raised by two hard-working parents who always pushed him to chase his dreams. His father, Gregory Donovan, labored at a local construction firm, while his mother, Martha Donovan, balanced two jobs as a part-time librarian and a seamstress. Despite their limited means, they poured every last drop of their energy into their only child's future. Marcus grew up witnessing their relentless dedication to forging a better life, and it shaped him into a man determined to succeed, no matter the cost. By the time he was in college at the University of Pennsylvania, majoring in business administration, Marcus was already known for his unmatched ambition. He interned at Anderson & Crowley, a well-regarded investment firm, where he had a knack for impressing powerful executives. They saw him not just as a bright mind, but as someone who could influence others with his charm. He had a disarming smile, a smooth voice, and a razor-sharp intellect. Everyone predicted his meteoric rise. It felt inevitable. It was during a university networking event that he met Eleanor Taylor, a graduate student in art history who was volunteering for the fundraiser. What started as a brief conversation about Renaissance art blossomed into an unanticipated bond. Eleanor's kind, unassuming spirit and genuine curiosity about life and culture captivated Marcus in ways he never experienced before. She came from a quiet, artistic family. Her mother, Lucinda Taylor, was a painter, and her father, Robert Taylor, taught music at a conservatory. Unlike Marcus's intense drive for business success, Eleanor dreamed of opening a small gallery to showcase her mother's and other emerging artists' work. Although their pursuits were seemingly dissimilar, the synergy between them was magnetic. Marcus loved that Eleanor's perspective gave him a refuge from the relentless hustle of his business environment. She, in turn, admired his ambition and believed in his potential to do great things. He gave her the confidence to dream bigger. She gave him the humility to remember that riches went far beyond what sat in a bank account. For a while, the relationship was pure bliss. Late-night study sessions, peppered with stolen kisses in the university library, romantic walks through Philadelphia's cobblestone streets, and unwavering support in each other's endeavors. Even as Marcus was pulled deeper into the world of high-stakes finance, he managed to carve out time for Eleanor. He promised her a future that glowed with love and adventure. "I'll give you the world," he would say, sealing it with a spontaneous weekend trip to some quaint bed and breakfast. Eleanor, an idealist at heart, believed in his vow wholeheartedly. When he proposed getting down on one knee in front of 100 flickering candles at her favorite local art gallery, she couldn't say yes fast enough. Their wedding in upstate New York was attended by family close friends and a smattering of powerful business connections that Marcus had made. It seemed like the start of a dream that would only grow more vibrant with time. But with the passage of years, the dream changed shape. As Marcus soared in his career, starting Donovan Capital Ventures and establishing connections with Silicon Valley elites, Wall Street executives, and international investors, the simple joys of everyday life slipped out of his reach. He and Eleanor were still deeply in love, but their time together dwindled. Business dinners, conferences, and networking events took precedence. Eleanor struggled with the sense that she was losing the man she had pledged her life to, though she tried her best to stay supportive. She started hosting art events to keep herself busy and to offer a platform for her mother's work. Yet she always tried to leave the front porch light on, hoping Marcus would come home early and remind her they were still the same people who once found refuge in each other's arms. Behind the polished veneer of success, cracks were forming cracks that wouldn't show themselves until life took a dramatic, life-altering turn. A year into their new life of glittering galas and high roller gatherings, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told Marcus one morning as he was rushing to finalize a major overseas deal. He was halfway out the door, coffee in one hand and a phone pressed to his ear, when she pulled him aside, eyes brimming with an anxious excitement. "Marcus," she said softly, "I'm pregnant." The moment froze. The phone call, the multi-million-dollar contract, waiting the business world swirling around him, it all faded. In that second, it was just him, Eleanor, and the promise of new life. He lifted her into his arms, tears of joy reflecting in both of their eyes. For the first time in a long time, the tension of business deals, deadlines, and responsibilities melted away. Life felt simple and hopeful again. Eleanor was 3 months pregnant when they decided to host a celebratory dinner at an upscale restaurant called the Redwood Lounge in Manhattan. They reserved a private room and invited their closest circle of friends and family, Marcus's parents. Gregory and Martha were there, beaming with pride. Eleanor's parents, Lucinda and Robert, were equally ecstatic. Champagne flowed, though Eleanor stuck to her sparkling grape juice. Amid toasts and laughter, Marcus promised again he would step back from the intensity of his schedule and be there for his growing family. He asked everyone to raise a glass and said, "To our unborn child and to the bright future we'll share." A wave of applause and cheers filled the room. In the weeks that followed, life felt like it was returning to that earlier state of bliss. Marcus took Eleanor to her doctor's appointments. He'd spend Saturdays helping her organize the spare room in their penthouse into a nursery. He even started thinking about a Babymoon, a pre-birth vacation for them to unwind and connect before the baby arrived. Eleanor's face lit up when he proposed 2 weeks in the south of France. It was a grand romantic gesture that made her hopeful they were truly turning a corner. But the closer they got to finalizing the trip dates, the more frequently those old habits crept in. Marcus would be called away on urgent business, or else he'd lock himself in his home office for hours glued to conference calls with Hong Kong investors. His free time evaporated again. Eleanor worried that if this was the pattern before the baby even arrived, how would he adjust once a newborn demanded all their attention and energy? Nonetheless, she kept faith. She knew business deals could be unpredictable, especially when millions of dollars were at stake. She rationalized, "He's doing this for us. He wants to secure our future. He'll be there when it matters most." It was a mantra she repeated each night, even as she felt the creeping loneliness that threatened to overshadow what should have been the happiest time of her life. Marcus, on the other hand, juggled overwhelming stress from multiple fronts. Donovan Capital Ventures was in a prime expansion phase, and missing crucial deals could mean losing the momentum he'd built over a decade. He justified each missed doctor's appointment and each cancelled dinner by telling himself that once the deals were sealed, he'd have the money and reputation to provide a life of comfort, no luxury for Eleanor and their child. So he pushed on day after day, fueling himself with ambition and adrenaline, hardly noticing that he was accelerating toward a moral precipice. As Donovan Capital Ventures expanded, Marcus came into contact with an even wider circle of corporate bigwigs, international deal-makers and socialites. One such acquaintance was Lawrence Chen, an influential tech magnate who had a flair for elaborate parties. Through Lawrence, Marcus found himself invited to exclusive yacht soirees on the Mediterranean high-stakes poker nights in Macau and lavish ski trips in the Swiss Alps. All these gatherings promised not only entertainment, but also a direct line to the world's wealthiest decision-makers. It was at one of Lawrence's high-profile events that Marcus first encountered Giuliana Moretti. She was an Italian-Brazilian heiress with a well-known family name, rumored to be an aspiring fashion designer, tall and poised with a graceful yet predatory air. She was the kind of woman who seemed to float through a room, drawing every eye. Her conversation was as sharp as her appearance. She'd spent her youth studying in the finest boarding schools in Europe, and she spoke 4 languages fluently. She seemed genuinely intrigued by Marcus's success story, or at least that's how she presented herself. He first noticed her at a New York charity gala, swirling her champagne and laughing with a group of media moguls. Their eyes locked, and for a brief moment, Marcus felt that old spark of curiosity. She was mesmerizing in a way that was impossible to ignore. After a polite introduction, they engaged in small talk about the charity's mission. Within minutes, they pivoted to more personal topics: her upcoming fashion line, his global expansion strategies, her travels across Asia. Giuliana lavished him with compliments that flattered not just his ego, but the deeper part of him that felt underappreciated and overstretched. She seemed to understand the pressures he was under, empathizing with the burden of steering a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Although he told himself it was harmless, Marcus began inviting Giuliana to smaller get-togethers with key investors. He valued her social acumen and thought she could help lubricate business discussions with her grace and wit. One dinner turned into another. Soon casual texts about upcoming events drifted into more personal territory. Giuliana was skilled at emotional lure, often sending messages late at night when Marcus's defenses were down. "I'm thinking of you. Hope you're getting some rest." Or, "You looked so stressed today. Remember to take care of yourself." Her words ignited a feeling of being seen and validated in a way he hadn't felt for months. The lines blurred so subtly that Marcus wasn't sure when their professional rapport shifted into a personal affair. Perhaps it was the night they attended an after-party in Monaco, where the champagne never stopped flowing, the music pulsed till dawn, and everyone else seemed consumed by their own indulgences. In a moment of disoriented excitement, Marcus found himself alone on a balcony with Giuliana. The moon glistened on the sea below, and her perfume swirled around him like an intoxicating promise. Before he fully comprehended, they were locked in a passionate kiss. The guilt that followed was profound, yet not enough to halt what they had begun. He told himself it was a one-time slip. However, the affair continued clandestine, but thrilling, fueling him with a sense of danger and novelty that overshadowed the moral voice within. Each time he returned home to Eleanor, who was by then visibly pregnant and glowing with maternal radiance, he felt a dual wave of shame and heartbreak. He still loved Eleanor, or so he claimed, yet he couldn't shake the magnetism of Giuliana, the adrenaline rush of their secret. Despite these pangs of conscience, he rationalized that it was his life too. He'd worked endlessly for success, so he had earned an escape from the daily grind. He believed that as long as Eleanor never found out, no harm was done. After all, he was still providing for his wife and child. He still intended to keep his promise of giving them everything, but in the hidden corners of his mind, even he couldn't ignore the flicker of trepidation. Some part of him knew that if Eleanor discovered his betrayal, it would unravel everything. By the 7th month of Eleanor's pregnancy, her doctor recommended a period of rest and relaxation. High blood pressure and stress were common in first-time mothers, and a calm environment could make all the difference. Eleanor, remembering Marcus's initial grand suggestion of a trip to the south of France, brought up the possibility again. Her voice carried a quiet plea. "You said we would go together, just you and me, before the baby arrives." He nodded absently, scanning through his phone's endless alerts. She cradled her expanding belly, waiting for him to look at her with warmth, waiting for the man she once knew to surface. Finally, he pressed his phone's screen off, right, of course. A Babymoon. He smiled, but it felt forced. "Let me get my schedule in order, and we'll plan something special." Eleanor's face lit with hope. She felt a gush of relief that perhaps the old Marcus was still there under the layers of suits, spreadsheets, and urgent phone calls. She suggested a quaint coastal town in the south of France, perhaps Cassis or Antibes, somewhere quieter than the usual tourist hotspots. He agreed, half listening, half distracted by the beeping of another incoming message. Within days, however, business crises flared up like wildfires. An investor in Hong Kong threatened to pull out of a major deal. A West Coast tech company's stock was plummeting, which threatened Donovan Capital's stake. Conference calls spanned time zones. Meetings doubled, then tripled. Every day, Marcus found a new reason to postpone the trip. "Just one more week," he kept promising. "We'll head out as soon as I sort this out." Eleanor tried to remain patient. She decorated the nursery carefully, choosing pastel shades of green and yellow. She arranged for a local carpenter to craft a handmade crib. She even started prenatal yoga to maintain her health and manage her stress. Still, the longing to spend meaningful time with Marcus grew stronger, and the heartbreak of repeated postponements deepened. In the midst of that turmoil, a cunning idea crept into Juliana's mind. She knew all about the Babymoon plan. Marcus had once carelessly mentioned it, not realizing how it might ignite her envy. Juliana wanted Marcus to herself, unencumbered by marital obligations or the looming presence of a child. She manipulated him, planting seeds of discontent and urging him to take her somewhere far from the prying eyes of the media and corporate watchers. For once, she wanted to see if Marcus would pick her convenience over his wife's rightful place. Marcus, exhausted and lured by the promise of unrestrained pleasure, found himself agreeing. In a moment of self-delusion, he convinced himself that a quick getaway with Juliana was a better move. He could merge leisure with networking, claiming that she had connections to an international fashion mogul who could become a valuable investor. In the twisted logic of a man who had already begun to tangle his moral compass, it seemed justifiable. So he booked the flights, 4 days in the south of France. Luxury suite at an exclusive resort in Cannes, complete with private beach access and a dedicated concierge. He told Eleanor he had to leave unexpectedly for a business emergency in Europe. She was nearly 8 months pregnant, but the heartbreak in her eyes didn't stop him. He packed his suitcase hurriedly one afternoon, gave her a tepid kiss on the cheek, and said he'd call every day. As Marcus and Juliana soared across the Atlantic, Eleanor was left alone in the penthouse, the Babymoon brochures still on the kitchen counter, mocking the dream that was never realized. She felt a swelling ache in her chest, part anxiety, part suspicion. Although she wanted to believe him, cracks in her trust had begun to form. She sensed that something was off, but she couldn't yet piece it together. In Cannes, Marcus and Juliana basked in the sun, sipping on exotic cocktails under striped beach umbrellas. They indulged in gourmet meals, danced late into the night, and posted snippets of their lavish escapade on social media, albeit carefully curated, to avoid revealing each other's identities. Too blatantly, Marcus's official story was that this was a critical investor meeting. But in a world as interconnected as theirs, secrets can slip through the cracks faster than a wave receding on the shore. A paparazzo named Henri Lambert was trailing various celebrities that weekend. He was known for sniffing out the hidden corners where Europe's rich and famous frolicked away from public view. While scanning the beach for a rumored Hollywood couple, he stumbled upon Marcus Donovan and Juliana Moretti instead. At first, he couldn't believe his luck. Marcus Donovan was a rising star in the finance world, rumored to be squeaky clean and happily married. Yet here he was, comfortably entwined with a woman who was definitely not his pregnant wife. Henry snapped a flurry of photos, the two of them sipping wine on a balcony, Juliana leaning in to whisper in Marcus's ear a playful kiss on the cheek. None of it left any plausible deniability. Henry knew he had gold in his camera, a scandal involving a high-profile millionaire about to become a father. Tabloid heaven. He quickly sold the photos to a gossip website known as the Gold Coast Insider. Within hours, the pictures went viral. Social media platforms lit up with speculation. Who is this mystery woman? Where is his wife? The images were accompanied by headlines dripping with condemnation. Marcus Donovan's secret. Babymoon with Mistress finance, mogul in a scandalous affair. Even mainstream news sites picked up the rumor mill Eleanor was home in New York, nursing an aching back and reading baby blogs when her phone buzzed non-stop. She opened one message to find a link from an old college friend. "Elle, please, tell me this isn't real." Followed by the incriminating photos. For a heartbeat, she felt like the ground caved in beneath her. The images showed Marcus in an unmistakably intimate pose with a glamorous brunette. Shock turned to devastation, then to rising anger. Betrayal scorched through her veins. She slumped on the living room couch, tears falling silently as she clutched her pregnancy bump. How could he do this to her, to them? Her phone calls to Marcus went unanswered. She tried texting him, but the messages remained unread. In a panic, she called her mother, Lucinda, who arrived within the hour, enveloping Eleanor in a maternal hug that momentarily soothed her shattered heart. Yet not even a mother's love could fully dull the sting of this calamity. The headlines were everywhere, and the story was unstoppable. When Marcus finally saw the tabloid news panic set in, he tried to contact his public relations team to mitigate the scandal, but the damage was already colossal. Investors started asking questions. His phone rang incessantly with messages from business partners, furious that this personal fiasco might tarnish their brand associations. Most of all, though, he dreaded hearing from Eleanor. He was 1,000 miles away, physically and emotionally, with no immediate plan to rectify the devastation he'd unleashed. Juliana, on the other hand, feigned worry, but secretly relished the storm. In her mind, this was an opportunity to force Marcus's hand. If his marriage was irrevocably damaged, he might choose her. She coaxed him, telling him that everything would be fine, that he could spin the narrative, but deep down she knew the path to power was lit up before her. Back in New York, Eleanor quietly fumed. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was a sense of betrayal that ignited a newfound resolve in her. She felt her unborn child move inside her, and that reminder filled her with fierce determination. The man she loved had humiliated her on a global stage. The father of her child had broken the final bond of trust. Through her tears, a seed of defiance began to grow. She would not crumble and be the sympathetic, powerless wife in this story. She would fight for her dignity and for her child's future. When Marcus returned to New York, the scandal was already raging. Eleanor met him in their penthouse, calm, composed, but with a steely gaze. "You've humiliated me," she said quietly. "You broke everything we built. I won't be a forgotten footnote in your story." Without drama or tears, Eleanor began to act. She may not have held financial power, but she knew her emotional and strategic contributions had helped shape Donovan Capital from the beginning. She hired Danielle Pierce, a formidable divorce lawyer, known for high-stakes corporate cases. Quietly they gathered evidence, financial records, contracts, early investments, all proving Eleanor's unseen influence in Marcus's empire. While Marcus focused on salvaging his image, Eleanor was preparing for war. Then came Juliana's twist, a sudden message claiming she was pregnant. Whether true or not, it rattled Marcus. But for Eleanor, it only fueled her resolve. She wasn't going to shield him anymore. With her baby due soon and the media still circling, Eleanor temporarily left the penthouse for her parents' quiet home. She wasn't retreating, she was regrouping. This time not as the betrayed wife, but as a woman ready to claim what was rightfully hers. As Eleanor's due date approached, the media frenzy refused to die down. Tongues wagged about whether she'd name Marcus as the father on the birth certificate if they proceeded with divorce. Stock in Donovan Capital Ventures dipped as rumors circulated that the founder was on the brink of losing control of his assets. Rival companies circled like sharks, ready to snap up clients or key employees who questioned Donovan Capital's stability. Under the weight of all these pressures, Marcus seemed to crumble. His once unshakable self-confidence slipped into desperation. He called Eleanor multiple times a day, begging for a face-to-face meeting. She granted him a single meeting under the watchful eye of her lawyer, Danielle Pierce, at a neutral location, a private conference room at Clark and Grayton. Law firm. When Marcus arrived, he looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, suit jacket hanging off his once proud shoulders. Eleanor, on the other hand, wore a simple navy maternity dress and radiated a quiet strength. She was mere weeks away from delivering her belly, a poignant reminder of all that was at stake. Marcus attempted a gentle approach. "Eleanor, I've made terrible mistakes," he said, voice trembling. "I want to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting sorrow and disappointment. Danielle, seated beside her, remained silent, but watchful. Finally, Eleanor replied softly, "We cannot be fixed." "Marcus, you did not just break our vows, you shattered my trust. That is something I can't repair. I'm here to discuss a settlement only for the sake of our child's future." Marcus pleaded for a second chance, enumerating the ways he could make amends. He would cut off Juliana completely, vow fidelity, attend therapy. However, the time for contrition had passed. Eleanor made it clear she wanted a divorce, and not just a simple one. She wanted a fair share of the empire, citing her intangible but vital contributions to the business's growth. Danielle slid a carefully prepared document across the table, listing assets that would be put in Eleanor's name. It included a controlling stake of certain business ventures, real estate properties, and trust funds for the child. Marcus's face blanched. His initial reaction was disbelief, followed by anger. "This is absurd," he spat. You have no right to dismantle my company." Danielle calmly explained the legal precedents supporting Eleanor's case. She detailed how the intangible contributions of a spouse could factor into a divorce settlement, particularly given the nature of how Donovan Capital Ventures expanded. She hinted at potential reputational damage if certain internal documents were made public. This was the final straw. The unspoken threat of financial audits, negative media attention, and investor flight made Marcus realize that losing a large portion of his empire might be unavoidable if he didn't negotiate. The meeting concluded in a cold standoff. Marcus stormed out, furious at Danielle, and by extension, furious at Eleanor. For her part, Eleanor left feeling both liberated and terrified. She was stepping into an unknown future, but at least she was no longer treading water in the whirlpool of Marcus's transgressions. She returned to her parents' home, trying to focus on her baby's imminent arrival, rather than the storm swirling around her. Eleanor went into labor on a quiet Sunday morning. The world outside was still enthralled with the scandal, but within the walls of Lucinda and Robert Taylor's home, all that mattered was bringing new life into the world. With her mother and a private doula by her side, Eleanor felt contractions that intensified by the hour Marcus received a call from Eleanor's mother, telling him that he could come to the hospital if he wished Eleanor had agreed for him to be present, not as her partner, but as the father of the child. Despite the tension, she believed their baby had the right to both parents at the birth. In a rush of guilt and paternal instinct, Marcus cancelled his meetings and raced to Mount Sinai Hospital. When he arrived, Eleanor was already in active labor, sweat beading on her forehead, breathing heavily through contractions. She acknowledged his presence with a nod. There was no forgiveness in her eyes, but there was also no malice at that moment. Whatever had passed between them, they were both there to welcome their child. After hours of determined pushing, baby Henry Donovan entered the world with a hearty cry. He had Eleanor's delicate features, but Marcus's intense gaze. Watching him take his first breath brought tears to Marcus's eyes. Tears of awe, shame, and overwhelming emotion. Eleanor spent from the labor, cradled Henry gently, all her focus on this tiny being who held the promise of a new beginning. For a brief time, the hospital room seemed suspended in tranquility. Marcus murmured an apology to Eleanor, and she simply nodded, too exhausted to pass the complexities of their fractured relationship. The press inevitably got wind of the birth, but the hospital's security kept them at bay. Danielle discreetly arranged for an extended stay, so Eleanor could recover, without the media circus camped outside her door. Yet the respite was short-lived. Once Henry was born, the details of the divorce settlement took on a new urgency. Even as he marveled at his newborn son, Marcus was bombarded by calls from his lawyers urging him to avoid signing away the empire. He faced a decision: risk a protracted legal battle that could drag on for years and wreak havoc on his business reputation, or meet Eleanor's demands for a settlement that would permanently alter his fortune. During one of Eleanor's quieter moments in the hospital, Marcus approached her. "I don't want to fight you in court. Our child shouldn't grow up watching us tear each other apart." Eleanor studied him, her expression neutral. She too didn't want a prolonged battle, especially with Henry's future to consider. She simply stated, "Then come to an agreement with Danielle. Stop trying to cling to power because in the end, you'll lose more than just money." In that moment, Marcus glimpsed anew. Eleanor resolved, resilient, and far from the naive, gentle soul he had once taken for granted. He recognized that she was not only fighting for her own dignity, but for the child they had brought into the world. Though a flicker of pride stirred in his heart at her strength, it was overshadowed by the realization that he was on the losing side of this battle. Morally, and soon financially, Eleanor Donovan sat in the back seat of a black SUV, its tinted windows shielding her from the flashbulbs that exploded along Manhattan's bustling sidewalks. Cradling baby Henry in her arms, she felt a surge of protectiveness and an equal measure of quiet determination. The day had finally come for her legal team to square off with Marcus and his lawyers. She gazed through the tinted glass at the soaring skyscrapers. Once this city had symbolized the pinnacle of her husband's ambition. Now it was the stage on which she would fight for her dignity, her child's future, and a fair claim to the empire she had helped build. The legal battleground was the top-floor conference suite at Clark & Grayton Law Firm, a stately glass tower rising like a monolith of power in midtown Manhattan. Eleanor's lawyer Danielle Pierce was known in elite circles as the litigator you'd hire if you had everything to lose. She had already amassed hundreds of files, emails and financial statements that documented the many ways Eleanor had contributed, directly or indirectly, to the expansion of Donovan Capital Ventures. And yet Danielle insisted on another layer of evidence personal testimony about Eleanor's role behind the scenes. The intangible but crucial ways she had secured philanthropic deals and introduced Marcus to key art investors now held center stage in the negotiations. In the weeks leading up to the showdown, Danielle worked around the clock. She had enlisted the help of forensic accountants to comb through Donovan Capital's labyrinthine web of offshore companies and shell subsidiaries. Every questionable transaction that might hint at hidden funds or deliberate concealments was highlighted and sorted into neat binders. There were also frantic late-night calls with potential witnesses like the couple's longtime financial advisor, Richard Albright, who'd confided how Eleanor's early inheritance had covered some of Marcus's high-risk investments. Eleanor had never bragged about that early contribution. She had believed in her husband wholeheartedly and wanted to see his dreams come true. Now that goodwill became proof of her rightful claim. Meanwhile, Marcus's legal team was scrambling to protect him. They were led by a seasoned corporate attorney named Vivian Hill, known for her no-nonsense style and an unflinching loyalty to wealthy executives. Vivian's approach was simple: attack, discredit, and minimize Eleanor's role. She intended to lean on the couple's prenuptial agreement, a document that on paper seemed to limit Eleanor's share should the marriage dissolve. But as Danielle Pierce liked to remind people in such high-stakes divorces, no prenup is bulletproof when moral turpitude and undisclosed assets come into play. Eleanor didn't attend the initial round of negotiations. Holding a newborn in a stuffy boardroom filled with adversaries was the last thing she wanted. Instead, she stayed in the comfort of her Brooklyn townhouse, nursing Henry, while Danielle and her associate Martin Feldman headed the talks. But the moment Danielle walked through those heavy glass doors, the tension was palpable. On one side of the long mahogany table, Marcus Donovan sat stiff-backed arms, folded protectively over his chest. His once impeccable confidence was fraying at the edges. Dark circles beneath his eyes hinted at nights lost to worry. The CFO of Donovan Capital, Daniel Redwood, a private confidant to Marcus for years, sat beside him in a pinstriped suit, methodically tapping a pen against a legal pad. Redwood's face gave nothing away, but the deeper lines on his brow suggested he knew exactly how precarious Marcus's position had become. Across from them was Danielle, impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit that seemed tailored to exude power. Her eyes flicked over the group in a cool, assessing glance, zeroing in on Marcus. "You did this to yourself, buddy," she seemed to say. Without uttering a word, Vivian Hill cleared her throat and began. "My client is prepared to offer a sizable monetary settlement," she said, handing out typed sheets. We respect Mrs. Donovan's contributions, but we believe the prenuptial agreement stands." Danielle allowed herself a small, knowing smile. She flipped through the pages without so much as a pause, and then calmly placed them on the table. "My client seeks more than a one-time payout. She seeks ongoing support for the child. Yes, but also recognition of the intangible support she gave to Donovan Capital. We have itemized evidence, emails, schedules, financial entries, showing how Mrs. Donovan facilitated multiple investor introductions and philanthropic partnerships that led to direct profitability for Donovan Capital." Vivian bristled but maintained her composure. "We dispute the scope of those contributions." Danielle's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps we should discuss the early loan from Mrs. Donovan's inheritance, which helped your client secure the original office space and cover those initial margin calls during Donovan Capital's first expansion phase. I believe the figure was—" She checked a document, $250,000, hardly pocket change. "We also have Mr. Richard Albright, the couple's longtime financial advisor, ready to testify that Mrs. Donovan's involvement was fundamental to the firm's survival in its infancy." Marcus's expression darkened. He had hoped that early personal loan would remain a forgotten piece of ancient history, but Danielle was resurrecting every skeleton buried in Donovan Capital's closet. Even as the negotiations grew heated, an unspoken spectre hovered over the table. Juliana Moretti, the mistress whose presence had triggered the avalanche of scandal. Though physically absent from the boardroom, her impact was undeniable. Gossip rags still speculated about her rumored pregnancy. Investors quietly mulled whether Donovan Capital was hemorrhaging funds to appease her. And in hushed conversations, people wondered if Juliana might sell her story to a tell-all publication. As if on cue, Marcus's phone buzzed noisily, cutting through the tense silence. He glanced at it and his jaw tightened. Danielle raised an eyebrow. Vivian slammed a folder shut, irate at the interruption. "We need a moment," Vivian announced, escorting Marcus into an adjacent private lounge. Inside the lounge, Marcus exhaled heavily. He stared at the text from Juliana. "We have unfinished business. If you don't meet me tonight, I'll go public." It was a threat she'd lobbed before, but in the heat of divorce negotiations, the stakes were higher than ever. "Is it her?" Vivian asked, arms crossed. "Yeah," Marcus muttered, rubbing his temples. "She's threatening to spill everything if I don't." Vivian cut him off, voice low with frustration. "We don't have time for this. We're already negotiating from a position of weakness. Danielle Pierce has evidence that could shred your reputation if it goes to trial. If Juliana also goes to the media, it's over. You'll lose what little leverage you have left." Marcus felt a swell of anger mingle with defeat. He wanted to lash out, to break something, to be rid of Juliana and her manipulations. But he was caught trapped by the consequences of his own betrayal. "What do I do?" he asked, almost whispering. "Handle it," Vivian said sharply. "Shut her down. Get her to sign an NDA. Throw money at her if you must. But do not let her sabotage these negotiations." When they returned to the conference room, Danielle and Martin were exchanging quiet words. Danielle looked up, assessing Marcus's grim expression. She could guess Juliana had just made her presence known again. Good, Danielle thought. Let him squirm. It only strengthened her side of the table. The negotiations resumed, and over the course of the next 3 hours the atmosphere grew even heavier. Danielle meticulously dissected Donovan Capital's structure, pointing to subsidiary after subsidiary that had flourished because of philanthropic connections forged by Eleanor. She cited philanthropic galas, where Eleanor had introduced Marcus to major art patrons like Penelope Carnegie, who later became a silent investor. She had emails confirming Eleanor's role in persuading a West Coast museum patron to place $1 million trust with Donovan Capital. On and on it went, each bullet point chipping away at the notion that Eleanor was merely a supportive spouse with no legal claim. Marcus's lawyers attempted to minimize and deflect. "These are normal acts of spousal support," Vivian stated firmly. "They don't necessarily translate into equity stakes or managerial control." Danielle caught Marcus's gaze. "My client is not asking for half the company," she explained, voice firm but measured. "She wants an equitable share, reflecting the intangible contributions that were instrumental in turning Donovan Capital into the success it is today. Moreover, she wants a controlling interest in the philanthropic branch, which was largely her brainchild." Marcus's brow furrowed. The philanthropic branch. A small part of the firm, yes, but one with growing influence and positive press. Handing it over would mean giving Eleanor a permanent seat at the table of Donovan Capital's future. He imagined the headlines, "Eleanor Donovan heads, philanthropic ventures after high-profile divorce." It made him feel nauseous, but his options were dwindling by the second. Redwood leaned in and whispered something to Marcus, presumably about the potential damage to investor confidence if the negotiations dragged on. Marcus nodded curtly, then turned to Vivian. They shared a brief, tense exchange of whispers. Finally, Vivian laid down her pen. "We will consider this philanthropic branch as negotiable." Danielle's eyes flicked to Martin, a silent note of victory passing between them. The philanthropic division was not just a footnote in Donovan Capital's portfolio. It was a rising star with significant press coverage for eco-friendly initiatives and socially responsible tech investments. Ceding control of it was a symbolic blow to Marcus's legacy. What followed was a grueling carousel of back-and-forth bartering. Marcus offered a one-time payout that would set Eleanor up for life. Danielle refused unless it included child support, reflecting the lifestyle Henry would have had if the marriage remained intact. When Marcus's team countered with a smaller monthly figure, Danielle threatened to reveal offshore accounts and questionable business practices. In open court, a guaranteed feeding frenzy for regulators and tabloids alike. Eleanor, following the negotiations from her home through text updates from Danielle, felt a swirl of emotions. Part of her despised the transactional nature of these talks. "This is my life," she thought. "My marriage." But there was no denying that wealth was a tool to secure a stable future for her son. She reminded herself that no amount of money could replace the trust Marcus had shattered, but it could ensure Henry never lacked for opportunity. Meanwhile, as the hours stretched, Marcus's phone kept buzzing. Juliana's messages grew more desperate. "Answer me or face the consequences." He battled the urge to throw his phone across the room. Danielle noticed his agitation and made a mental note that Juliana's tactics were likely driving him to make hurried decisions, an advantage for her client. At around 7 in the evening, both teams called for a recess, leaving the table strewn with legal pads, half-empty coffee cups, and a storm of scattered documents. Marcus slumped in his chair, loosened his tie, and rubbed his eyes. In the hallway, Redwood took a phone call from the Donovan Capital board, who demanded an update. The board was growing furious at the negative media coverage. They wanted this scandal tidied up faster. Danielle and Martin stepped into a private corner where they whispered about final strategies. "If we push him on philanthropic control, we can likely secure a stake in that ecotech subsidiary too." Martin suggested. Danielle nodded, eyes gleaming. With the board pushing Marcus to settle, he was more malleable to their demands. She drafted a quick bullet list on her tablet, preparing for one last push when they reconvened. An hour later, the negotiations climaxed. Vivian, clearly exasperated, announced, "We have a client who is willing to cooperate, but only if the settlement includes confidentiality clauses about Donovan Capital's internal finances. Danielle nodded. We can include mutual NDAs on the finances, on the condition that Mrs. Donovan retains complete ownership of the philanthropic branch and partial equity in the Ecotech spin-off. She handed over a revised agreement. Sign this tonight, or we walk away and proceed to trial. Marcus locked eyes with Danielle, then lowered his gaze to the document. He knew this was the best offer he'd get. If he went to court, Danielle could drag out every skeleton in Donovan Capital's closet, not just the affair, but any shady financial corners he'd cut in the firm's early days. Share prices would plummet, and the board would oust him for good. He gave a weary nod to Vivian, who let out a resigned sigh and pushed the papers across the table. Donovan, Vivian said, extending a pen sign here. Marcus gripped the pen, his gaze distant, as he scrawled his signature in the designated boxes. With each stroke of ink, a chunk of his empire slipped away. Danielle carefully collected the documents. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," she said, her tone formal. She tapped them into a neat stack and placed them in her briefcase. "My client appreciates your cooperation, and I'll have the final copies delivered to you by tomorrow." Standing, Marcus thrust his hands into his pockets and stared at the floor. He'd never felt so powerless. The hush in the room was thick with finality. Later that night in her Brooklyn townhouse, Eleanor received a phone call from Danielle. "It's done," Danielle announced. "We have controlling interest of the philanthropic branch, partial equity in Ecotech, sufficient child support, and a non-disclosure arrangement to protect your personal details. Henry will be well provided for, and you'll have the freedom to guide the philanthropy division. However you see fit." Eleanor closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Relief mingled with a pang of sorrow. She'd stood up for herself and won. But it had come at the cost of accepting that her marriage and the man she'd once adored were lost to a web of lies and betrayal. Still, as she looked down at baby Henry, dozing in a bassinet nearby, she felt a flicker of hope. He would never want for stability or security. She had ensured that his future wasn't tied to Marcus's reckless choices. Across town, Marcus sat alone in his penthouse, now stripped of many personal touches, as Eleanor's belongings had been removed. The echoing silence was almost cruel. His phone buzzed again. Juliana, no doubt. He stared at the screen but couldn't bring himself to answer. His empire was in freefall, his reputation tarnished, and the only family he had now seemed beyond his reach. He sank into a leather armchair, head in his hands, as the lights of the city stretched out below him in apathetic indifference. The legal war was over, but the aftermath would ripple for years. In the eyes of the world, Eleanor had seized a critical piece of Donovan Capital's future, an accomplishment that would soon send her star rising in philanthropic and business circles alike. Marcus, once hailed as a visionary titan, watched his kingdom fracture under the weight of his own hubris. And somewhere out there, in the swirl of scandal and secrecy, Juliana Moretti plotted her next move, determined to claim whatever she could from the empire's wreckage. But for Eleanor, the greatest triumph was not the money or even the philanthropic branch. It was reclaiming her autonomy, proving that she was more than just a shadow in Marcus's ambitious world. The settlement marked an end, yet for her and Henry, it was also the quiet beginning of a far more authentic life, one built on the unshakable foundation of self-respect and unconditional love. In the weeks after the settlement, life moved at a breathless pace. Marcus attempted damage control with his board, reassuring them that Donovan Capital Ventures still had strong leadership. However, the trust between him and his key partners was irrevocably eroded. Several major investors parted ways, citing moral and reputational concerns. Others demanded restructuring that further diluted Marcus's control. Juliana's claims of pregnancy were eventually discredited. She had never provided legitimate proof, and many suspected it was a ploy. Jilted and humiliated, she slinked off to Europe, facing her own set of gossip. By contrast, Eleanor found a surprising sense of renewal. She relocated to a serene townhouse in a family-friendly neighborhood in Brooklyn. With her parents' help, she furnished the space so it exuded warmth and creativity. Local artwork on the walls, a cozy reading nook by the window, and a sunlit nursery for Henry between breastfeeding late-night lullabies and the occasional meltdown. She felt more alive than ever. There was sadness still for the broken dreams and the man she once loved. But she also felt unshackled free to chart her own course. Despite not being a ruthless business tycoon, Eleanor found herself thrust into an unexpected position of power. The philanthropic branch of Donovan Capital that she controlled needed direction, and she gave it wholeheartedly. She rebranded it as the Green Horizon Fund, focusing on eco-sustainability, social justice initiatives, and arts in underprivileged communities. She hired a small team of like-minded individuals, some from Marcus's circle, who felt more aligned with her vision. In an ironic twist, the Green Horizon Fund quickly garnered positive media attention, drawing in philanthropic entrepreneurs who had grown skeptical of traditional profit-obsessed finance. Financially secure from the divorce settlement, Eleanor didn't have to scramble for revenue. Instead, she invested her emotional energy in building a legacy that Henry could be proud of. The mother who once quietly supported her husband's dream now became a leader in her own right. And the world noticed, meanwhile. Marcus struggled in the shadows. The scandal's aftershock still rippled through the corporate world, making every new partnership a challenge. He sold off some properties to maintain the liquidity needed to stabilize Donovan Capital. Investors demanded transparency, and he spent sleepless nights just trying to preserve what was left. The flamboyant lifestyle he once enjoyed with private jets and lavish parties was replaced by frantic, damage-control dinners and closed-door negotiations. The final blow, Karma's crowning moment, arrived when a whistleblower from Juliana's circle leaked incriminating details of Marcus's offshore accounts and questionable business practices. Though not entirely illegal, the revelations cast serious doubts on his ethics. Regulators launched inquiries. The board forced him to temporarily step down as CEO, installing an interim figurehead to steer Donovan Capital until the dust settled. Marcus, once the unstoppable force in the world of high finance, found himself drowning in self-inflicted misery. He tried to see Henry when he could court-ordered visitation schedules. Sometimes he'd gaze at his son in the crib, marveling at how pure and untainted the child was by the swirling chaos. In those tender, wordless moments, he realized the depth of his miscalculation. He had gained the world in fleeting fame and fortune, but lost the loyalty of a good woman, the stability of a solid family, and the respect of those who once admired him. Eleanor, on the other hand, glowed with the fulfillment of someone who had found her path, albeit through heartbreak. She no longer carried the illusions of a fairy tale marriage. Instead, she stood firm on a foundation of self-worth, maternal devotion, and a dream that had become her own to shape. She was far from perfect. Late nights still brought sorrowful memories, and the weight of single parenthood was immense. But each step forward, every milestone in the Green Horizon Fund and every coo or giggle from Henry reminded her that she was not just surviving. She was thriving. In the end, the story of Marcus Donovan's Babymoon betrayal was overshadowed by a far more compelling narrative. The remarkable resilience of Eleanor Donovan, the woman who refused to be a victim of circumstance. She had taken the shattered pieces of her marriage and transformed them into building blocks for a future she could proudly call her own. The empire that Marcus once claimed as his birthright was now reshaped by the very person he had betrayed, and the world applauded the justice in that reversal of fortune. In this whirlwind saga of infidelity, heartbreak, and karmic justice, we've witnessed how a man's towering ambitions and insatiable desires can unravel everything he cherishes. From the moment Marcus Donovan betrayed his pregnant wife to the day she claimed a defining stake in his empire, destiny proved that true power lies not in wealth, but in loyalty, trust, and resilience. Eleanor's journey, rising from the ashes of humiliation to build a life of purpose and success, reminds us that no betrayal is ever the final chapter, and redemption often favors the strong of heart. While his pregnant wife cried at home, the millionaire posted vacation. Pics with his mistress. Then came the audit. They say that beneath every polished photograph lies a truth we dare not expose. Meet Mark Rutherford, a millionaire who appeared to have it all, a sprawling empire, gleaming sports cars and high society connections from New York to Monaco. His social media profiles flaunted sun-kissed getaways with an alluring woman at his side, but the world didn't know the tears he left behind. At home, Mark's pregnant wife, Angela, anxiously awaited his return, watching in despair as he posted glamorous vacation photos with his secret mistress. Little did he realize that a brutal audit loomed on the horizon, poised to shatter his perfect facade. At first glance, the life of Mark Rutherford looked like a fairy tale. Hailing from a modest neighborhood in upstate New York, Mark had ascended the social and financial ladder at breathtaking speed. He had rebranded himself into a savvy businessman who moved effortlessly in circles filled with CEOs, philanthropists, and venture capitalists from Manhattan. Guests at his lavish parties would whisper about Mark's meteoric rise, debating whether his success was the product of ruthless cunning, uncanny luck, or possibly both. His wife, Angela Rutherford, had grown up in an entirely different environment, sunlit farmland just outside Buffalo, A. Kind and gentle soul. Angela had fallen for Mark's charm when they were young. In those early years, he possessed a rare combination of drive and tenderness. She could still recall the day he proposed an intimate picnic near a serene lake where he vowed to cherish her forever. Although the lake was hardly a glamorous setting, the genuine emotion in Mark's eyes made every breeze and sunbeam feel like divine blessings upon their union. Their first few years of marriage were marked by humble dreams and long conversations about building a stable future. Angela had a warm smile and an unyielding belief in Mark's potential. She supported him when he launched his first company, a small tech startup, funded by meager savings and the generosity of a few distant relatives. She listened patiently to his late-night brainstorming sessions and scribbled business plans on napkins. She believed wholeheartedly in the man who had once promised her that no matter how high he soared, he would never leave her side. But success, as it often does, transformed Mark. The better the company did, the more Mark's life became a whirlwind of red carpet galas, midnight phone calls with overseas clients, and secretive deals that always seemed to happen behind closed doors. Angela initially chalked it up to the demands of business. He was forging connections, building a network, ensuring they would never again fret about money. But as Mark's taste for luxury intensified, so did the gap between them. No longer content with a quiet dinner at home, he began to crave expensive restaurants, dinners with powerful executives, and weekends aboard yachts docked in exclusive marinas. During this swift transition from middle-class comfort to extravagant wealth, Angela sometimes felt like a relic of Mark's past. She struggled to navigate the new social circles he so eagerly embraced. It wasn't that Angela lacked sophistication, she simply had a different set of values. Surrounded by glitzy soirees and endless champagne flutes, Angela found herself quietly pining for their old lives, where a single bouquet of daisies and an evening stroll could ignite her spirit more than any five-star event. When Angela discovered she was pregnant, she hoped it might rekindle the warmth and closeness they once shared. She dreamed of Mark's strong arms wrapped around her, whispering excited plans for a nursery. Yet from the very first conversation, she sensed his excitement was tainted. Instead of wholeheartedly celebrating her news, he mumbled something about how a baby might complicate ongoing deals. She tried to reassure him that they would navigate parenthood just like any other challenge, united by love and commitment. But the more her belly grew, the more Mark seemed to drift. Business expansions, urgent calls from Hong Kong, clandestine texts that he refused to show her. These all took precedence. Angela, in the softness of her heart, convinced herself that Mark was merely stressed. He was under intense pressure, or so he said. If anything, it was a testament to how dedicated he was to providing a secure life for their future child. She held on to that thought like a lifeline, refusing to consider more troubling possibilities. Meanwhile, Mark privately relished his newfound status among the mega-rich. He had formed partnerships with influential names. One such person was Richard Caldwell, a private equity mogul known for his hush-hush real estate acquisitions from Manhattan to Los Angeles. Caldwell quickly became more than just a business contact. He was also Mark's mentor in the art of living lavishly, constantly reminding him, wealth is not just about what you own. It's about how you display it. Between the constant swirl of business negotiations and late-night private gatherings at Caldwell's penthouse, Mark found himself on a slippery slope of moral compromises. It wasn't just about ignoring Angela. He was now drawn to a lifestyle where excess blurred ethical lines, and where loyalty even to one's spouse became just another disposable commodity. In the back of his mind, Mark rationalized everything. He was simply seizing opportunities that his younger self could only dream about. After all, once the dust settled, he'd settle down. He promised himself he would eventually focus on family life. Among the wave of new faces entering Mark's life was Cassie Delgado, a striking woman with flowing auburn hair who exuded confidence and ambition. She first appeared on the scene as a marketing consultant recommended by one of Mark's investors. Their initial meeting took place in a sleek Manhattan boardroom, and Cassie left a powerful impression. She had a knack for reading a room, understanding its power dynamics, and adjusting her tone to sway the conversation in her favor. Mark watched, half amazed and half envious, as she negotiated cutting-edge promotional deals with an ease and flair that rivaled his own. She was more than an adept negotiator. Her presence was magnetic. Cassie was the kind of woman who seemed to invite confessions and temptations, her laughter hinting at secrets waiting to be uncovered. When Mark discovered she came from a modest background much like his, he felt an immediate sense of kinship. She too had clawed her way up from near obscurity. They bonded over shared stories of once living paycheck to paycheck, mocking the condescending attitudes they endured from privileged elites. And yet, while Angela's gentle innocence had once captivated Mark, Cassie's fierceness both inspired and intimidated him. On the surface, they formed a natural professional alliance, two driven personalities with matching hunger for wealth and influence. Beneath that veneer, however, a different chemistry was building. Mutual admiration soon morphed into flirtatious texts, then secret coffee dates under the guise of client meetings. Cassie was shrewd enough to know exactly what she wanted. She was not a naive romantic easily carried away by Mark's charms. She calculated every advantage that could be gained from their liaison. Whenever Mark talked about his personal life, Cassie would gently place a hand on his shoulder, tilt her head with empathy, and convince him that she alone understood his pressures. At first, it was subtle comfort during stressful work situations. But as time wore on, those stolen moments felt like portals to an alternate reality, where Mark wasn't obligated to be the doting husband or expectant father. He was free to indulge in Cassie's wiles, free to forget that Angela existed at home, softly crying herself to sleep. Each clandestine meeting fueled an adrenaline rush, unlike anything Mark had felt before. One evening, Cassie invited him to a high-end fashion show, after party, an event teeming with celebrities and socialites. Mark reasoned it was good for networking, so he attended in the dimly lit VIP lounge amid pulsing music and expensive champagne. Mark kissed Cassie for the first time. Angela was thousands of miles away in Buffalo for a prenatal checkup, but even if she had been in the same city, Mark doubted the outcome would have changed. Cassie was intoxicating. For a while, their affair was their best-kept secret. Mark rationalized that no real harm was done. He was merely satisfying a physical and emotional itch. Business thrived, and Mark promised himself that once the baby arrived, he would end it. He pictured a scenario in which he'd gracefully cut ties with Cassie, quietly return to Angela, and no one would ever know. But the more he tried to imagine an exit strategy, the deeper he sank into Cassie's enticements. Before long, Cassie began to sense Mark's warring guilt. She was nobody's fool. She noticed the anxious tone in his voice after each rendezvous and spotted the wedding ring he rarely took off. Yet she never pushed for a more official status. She didn't need to. Her hold over him was strong enough, and she reaped benefits as his preferred consultant, winning her lucrative contracts. Unbeknownst to Mark, Cassie also had connections in other circles. She heard whispers of the IRS investigating not just Mark's businesses, but also Caldwell's. These tidbits floated around black tie galas and hush-hush dinners. She gleaned from passing remarks how Mark's deals sometimes skirted the edges of legality. It was all speculation, but she kept it stored in the back of her mind should she ever need an ace up her sleeve. Angela, meanwhile, was growing more anxious by the day. Mark's excuses for his long absences piled up crucial deals, hectic travel schedules, emergency client meetings at odd hours. At times, Angela tried to voice her concerns, but Mark always brushed them off with dismissive gestures, telling her not to stress herself out during the pregnancy. Each time she felt a nagging sense that something was deeply amiss, but she forced herself to believe Mark's explanations. After all, how could the father of her unborn child be unfaithful? He was the man who once sobbed tears of joy when she agreed to marry him. Yet on nights when the loneliness grew unbearable, Angela couldn't help scrolling through Mark's social media, analyzing every new post or tagged photo like a detective on the verge of an explosive revelation. She couldn't place it exactly, but she sensed that the radiant smile on Mark's face in those pictures wasn't the same one he reserved for her or once had. Something vital had changed. It was as if he had found a new source of excitement, leaving Angela feeling more invisible with each passing day. Angela had no idea that an even bigger betrayal was about to blow their world apart, that her husband's business partner was really a mistress, and neither Mark nor Cassie suspected that the glittering tapestry of their covert romance was about to be torn asunder by forces far beyond their control. After all, if there's one thing life teaches us, it's that no secret can stay hidden forever, and that a reckoning is inevitable when you've built your castle on shifting sand. At home, each day of Angela's pregnancy crawled by like a slow-moving storm cloud. She had hoped that her growing belly would be a beacon of joy for both her and Mark, proof that love could endure beyond the manic hustle of corporate life. Instead, she found herself more alone than ever. Friends suggested prenatal yoga, childbirth classes, or baby shower plans, but Angela found it hard to join in the celebrations. How could she rejoice when Mark seemed only half present? Angela's symptoms, morning sickness, mood swings, and constant fatigue, were magnified by emotional distress. Nights brought panic attacks that left her trembling under the covers, her tears dampening the pillow. Where was the partner who had once held her tight, reminding her that everything would be okay? Where was the man who had promised to love her in sickness and in health? When she tried to reach out, the phone calls went unanswered or were hurriedly cut short. Mark's texts, once affectionate, devolved into bullet points of half-hearted excuses. He reassured her, big project in Hong Kong, investors in town, busy with conference calls, will be home soon. Angela yearned to believe these promises, but as the weeks went on, she could sense the widening gap. She sought solace in memories of happier times, the first months of their marriage, in a small but cozy apartment, the simple act of cooking dinner together, laughing at inside jokes no one else could understand. Now the mansion they called home felt like an empty museum, its gilded ornaments and plush furniture mocking her loneliness. The house staff, housekeeper, chef, and driver tried to care for Angela, but their presence only highlighted Mark's absence. One evening, determined to bring back a shred of normalcy, Angela arranged a special dinner, complete with soft candlelight and her favorite homemade lasagna. She spent hours meticulously preparing each ingredient, all in hopes that Mark would come home and remember the love they once shared. She waited, her heart pounding at each passing minute. Midnight came and went, and by 1 in the morning the lasagna was cold and her tears were hot on her cheeks. Mark never walked through the door. Days blurred together in a monotonous cycle of doctor's visits and heartbreak. Angela's obstetrician, Dr. Viola Bancroft, gently advised her to minimize stress, emphasizing how harmful chronic anxiety could be for both mother and baby. Angela tried. She practiced deep breathing exercises, wrote in a journal, and consulted with a pregnancy counselor. In private moments, she'd place her hand on her belly, speaking softly to the life growing within her. She promised her unborn child that no matter what, they would be loved. Even if Mark never returned to them in the way he once was, Angela resolved to be strong. But that resolve wavered whenever Angela spotted something suspicious online. Mark's social media, once a tame collection of business achievements and philanthropic engagements, had transformed into a gallery of exotic beaches, poolside cocktails, and glamorous parties. And he wasn't alone in these photos. A beautiful red-haired woman, sometimes tagged as Cassie Delgado, appeared in the background, or sometimes right by Mark's side. The two looked far too comfortable, far too close. Angela tried to reason with herself that maybe it was innocent, a professional associate or a friend. Yet the intimacy in their smiles felt like a dagger in Angela's heart. She dared not question Mark about it directly. She feared the answers she might get, or worse, the way he might dismiss her concerns altogether. Still, the seed of suspicion grew fueled by late-night social media stalking and the silent agony of her intuition. Each time Angela tried to bring up Cassie's name, Mark would brush it off, repeating lines like, "She's a valuable consultant," or We're finalizing a huge deal, stop worrying. Angela's internal turmoil escalated until one night she broke down completely. She found herself curled up on the floor of the master bedroom, phone clutched in her shaking hand, sobbing uncontrollably. The images of Mark's apparent happiness with this other woman tormented her. Her growing stomach only served as a painful reminder that while her body prepared for motherhood, Mark seemed to be living a carefree, childless existence. Amid her tears, Angela realized something she was witnessing. Mark's transformation into the kind of man he once despised, someone who put material success and fleeting pleasures above everything else, including loyalty and love. The questions piled up. Could she trust him anymore? Would he even want to be part of the baby's life? And what if these business trips were mere covers for wild vacations with Cassie? Quietly, Angela decided that if Mark refused to come home to her, she would seek the truth on her own terms. She began to imagine confronting him directly, to see his reaction, to see if he'd lie to her face. For Angela, the days of silent suffering might soon come to an end. But before she could fully plan her confrontation, fate began its own countdown. Forces were converging behind the scenes, angry investors, suspicious auditors, and the unstoppable momentum of gossip that swirled through the social circles Mark desperately tried to impress. Unaware of the storm that lay ahead, Angela continued to cling to one fragile hope that Mark would redeem himself before it was too late. Beachfront villas, crystal blue waters, and indulgent spa treatments at world-class resorts. This was Mark's new normal whenever he traveled with Cassie. The pair found endless excuses to combine work trips with scenic getaways, posting tastefully curated snapshots on social media. In each photo, Mark radiated a carefree smile, as if the sum of his worries amounted to nothing more significant than choosing the next cocktail to sip. Cassie orchestrated every shot, understanding the power of optics. She took great care to capture Mark against a backdrop of towering palm trees, their fronds swaying above him like a king's canopy. In some photos, Cassie stood at the edge of the frame, an enigmatic figure sipping champagne. The images ignited social media buzz and gossip in their swanky circles. Who is that stunning redhead with Mark Rutherford? Is she his new business partner or something more? The speculation only added to the thrilling aura of their forbidden escapade. For Mark, the vacation pics served a dual purpose. First, they fed his ego. After years of hustling to get recognized by society's upper echelons, he relished every like, comment, and message praising his amazing life. Second, they were a form of self-deception. If he convinced the world he was happy, maybe he could stifle the nagging guilt in his conscience. Guilt about leaving Angela alone at home, pregnant and distraught. Of course, Mark conveniently never mentioned Angela in these posts, nor did he reveal the existence of an unborn child. He rationalized that it was a private matter, not suited for public consumption. When friends and acquaintances inquired about Angela, he'd respond with vague statements. Oh, she's busy preparing for the baby, or traveling isn't safe for her right now. He avoided deeper questions at all costs. The last thing he wanted was an unscripted interview on how his personal life was unraveling. Cassie, meanwhile, reveled in her rising social profile. She found herself tagged in photos by influencers and minor celebrities who recognized Mark's wealth and Cassie's clever marketing strategies. Doors to exclusive events opened, wider brunch invitations from industry heavyweights rolled in. Through all this, Cassie remained calculated. She encouraged Mark to spend more lavishly to cultivate a public image as a worldly magnate on the verge of major global deals. That meant private jets instead of first-class commercial flights, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, and suites in the most luxurious hotels. Mark complied, though each charge made his accountants and financial managers increasingly anxious. None of this extravagance occurred without cost. Mark's fluid capital was tied up in high-risk ventures. Liquidity was tighter than appearances suggested. He juggled lines of credit and questionable transactions, leaning heavily on Caldwell's counsel. Caldwell, too, urged Mark to keep the momentum of success going. "Fake it till you make it" was essentially their unspoken mantra. As long as public perception remained, stellar deals would keep flowing, and the heavy interest rates and balloon payments could be pushed further into the future. But cracks in the glossy surface began to form. On a particular getaway in Fiji, Mark received a barrage of frantic texts from his CFO. Financial regulators were poking around. Some suspicious wire transfers were flagged. Panicked investors were demanding clarifications on how Mark's so-called expansions aligned with his sudden personal spending. Mark tried to brush it off, determined not to let anything ruin his beach holiday with Cassie. He reasoned that this was just a minor hiccup. Nothing a few well-placed phone calls and quick financial maneuvers couldn't fix. Cassie, ever attuned to the slightest shift in Mark's mood, pressed him for details. He only offered vague reassurances about routine audits and overzealous inspectors. This was the first time she witnessed a real worry flicker behind Mark's confident facade. Sensing the potential threat to her cushy arrangement, Cassie tried to downplay it, coaxing him back into the carefree zone. They snapped more radiant selfies on the shore, hoping to drown out reality with digital illusions. Unbeknownst to them, Angela was scrolling through these very pictures. At that moment, tears streaming down her cheeks as she recognized the hotel's name from a travel magazine. The woman in Mark's arms wasn't just a business partner. No professional consultant gazed at a client with such intimate adoration. Angela felt a sharp ache in her chest as she realized how little Mark cared about hiding his betrayal. The audacity of his posts was almost surreal. Desperation clawed at Angela's insides. Perhaps confronting him through a phone call where she could hear his voice break if he lied was her best shot at forcing the truth. Gathering her nerve, she dialed Mark's number. No answer. She tried again and again, only to be met with voicemail. Anger flared up in her, a rage she'd never felt before. This was no longer a series of unfortunate misunderstandings or too busy at work moments. This was blatant humiliation. In the background, the swirl of an IRS investigation was growing stronger. Anonymous tips and suspicious transaction reports had caught the attention of forensic accountants who were beginning to follow the money trail. The timing of Mark's lavish travels raised red flags. Why, they wondered, would a businessman under such financial scrutiny broadcast opulent holidays across social media? Didn't he realize that auditors often examine lifestyle displays as part of their case? For Mark, ignorance felt like bliss. The more pictures he posted, the less real his looming problems seemed. Yet reality was closing in fast. The golden sand and azure waves might have served as a temporary stage for his fabricated paradise, but the tides were about to shift. And when they did, they'd wash away more than just footprints in the sand. While Mark and Cassie soaked in, the Fiji Sun agents at the Internal Revenue Service's Manhattan branch started piecing together fragments of an intricate puzzle. Spearheading the investigation was a meticulous auditor named Mallory Finch, reputed for her tenacity and keen ability to spot inconsistencies in vast financial records. Mallory had received a discreet tip about Mark Rutherford's questionable income streams, and once she opened his file, she discovered an alarming mismatch between his reported earnings and the lifestyle he flaunted. Mallory was never one to jump to conclusions, but the more she dug, the more anomalies she found. A sudden influx of capital suspiciously timed with Mark's social media updates of private jet getaways, a pattern of shell companies popping up in multiple states, then vanishing without clear financial statements, offshore accounts vaguely tied to Mark's business, some of which contained substantial deposits from individuals flagged for previous tax evasion. These pieces raised her eyebrows, and Mallory suspected this investigation could balloon into something far larger than a mere tax discrepancy. Her next step involved contacting individuals who might share insights on Mark's dealings. One name that kept surfacing was Richard Caldwell, the private equity mogul rumored to have a hand in Mark's expansions. Caldwell himself was already under IRS scrutiny for unrelated properties in Florida and the Carolinas. If Caldwell and Mark were pooling resources in some illicit scheme, it could spell big headlines. Mallory prepared requests for bank statements, wire transfers, credit card expenditures, anything that would illustrate the true scope of Mark's financial empire. At the same time, Mark's CFO, Brian Cummings, was drowning in chaos. As soon as he noticed the heightened interest from regulatory authorities, Brian tried to warn Mark, but each call went unanswered, each email unreturned. Panic thrummed in Brian's chest. The entire finance department was on edge, especially after receiving official requests from the IRS for detailed financial records. Paper trails that Mark had insisted be handled discreetly were now fair game. If Mark didn't address these issues promptly, the meltdown would be inevitable. Behind the scenes, Caldwell played it cool. In public, he would toast Mark as a brilliant entrepreneur and encourage him to keep up appearances. In private, Caldwell had already started distancing himself, transferring assets, and instructing his own legal team to prepare for inquiries. If the walls caved in, Caldwell intended to emerge with minimal damage, leaving Mark to shoulder the brunt of the consequences. Word of the looming audit spread quietly through Manhattan's financial circles. Bankers and lawyers connected to Mark had hushed luncheons, speculating about the magnitude of his troubles. Some predicted he'd face a heavy fine at best, or a full-scale criminal investigation. At worst, a few even took delight in the prospect of Mark's downfall, viewing it as an inevitable collapse for a man who rose too fast, spent too freely, and believed himself untouchable. Meanwhile, Angela was oblivious to the complexities of Mark's finances. Her world was confined to heartbreak and concern over her unborn child. She knew Mark must be in trouble. The abrupt changes in his behavior, the money he threw around so casually, the hush-hush deals he once mentioned but refused to elaborate upon. Yet she couldn't fathom the depth of the scandal brewing. Each day her anxiety deepened, a feeling that something catastrophic was hovering just out of sight. It all came to a head when Angela received a strange phone call from one of Mark's junior associates, a woman named Kara Hoffman. Although Kara didn't divulge specifics, she sounded panicked. "Angela, I don't know if you're aware, but there are investigations going on. Things look bad." Angela's heart pounded in her ears as Kara's words spilled over the line. "We're being asked for documents, receipts. I think Mark's in serious trouble. And look, this might not be my place, but I think you should know Mark's not who he used to be." Angela thanked Kara, her mind spiraling with questions. What exactly were they investigating? Had Mark committed fraud? Was he actually bankrupt and hiding the truth? The uncertainties gnawed at her. She ended the call feeling more determined than ever to confront Mark. She realized that her heartbreak over his possible affair was only one part of a bigger, uglier picture. If he was entangled in financial crimes, her unborn child's future would be at stake too. In Fiji, Mark was irritated to see a slew of missed calls from Brian and a cryptic text from Caldwell. "We need to talk ASAP." He tried to keep his calm exterior, but Cassie noticed the worry lines etched across his brow. Over an expensive bottle of wine at a cliffside restaurant, Mark finally admitted to her that the IRS might be launching a routine audit, but insisted it was nothing major. Cassie, who had heard different rumors from her insider network, suspected it was more serious than Mark let on. Yet she feigned reassurance, drawing Mark into a languid embrace. They'd handle it together, she cooed. They were unstoppable when united. That night, however, Cassie stepped outside onto the moonlit beach and placed a phone call to one of her closest confidants, an attorney who specialized in corporate law. Just in case she wanted to know her rights and potential liabilities, if Mark went down, Cassie had no intention of going down with him. Far away from that tranquil beach, Mallory Finch and her team worked late hours, scanning through reams of documents. Something big was surfacing, a web of shell companies, unaccounted funds, and potential tax evasion, so blatant it nearly dared the authorities to react. As she compiled her findings, Mallory sensed a storm about to erupt. The wealthy always believed they could outrun the law, but in her experience, hubris was their undoing. She gave a final glance at Mark's social media feed, scoffing at the gall of a man who flaunted paradise while standing at the brink of a scandal. Angela stood at the top of the grand staircase, the late afternoon sun illuminating her pregnant silhouette as she awaited Mark's return. She had summoned every last shred of courage to do what she should have done weeks ago, demand answers face to face. The house staff, sensing the tension, made themselves scarce. Rarely did Angela request the entire household's presence be minimal, but now she needed privacy. She needed space to unleash her anguish without an audience. Finally, Mark entered, dragging a suitcase behind him. He looked exhausted, yet still wore that forced confidence he had perfected in boardrooms. Angela's throat constricted at the sight of him. This was the man she'd once adored, now nearly a stranger. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed anger and hurt. Mark's immediate instinct was to deflect Angela. "I've just come off a long flight. Can we do this later?" He began massaging his temples dramatically, but Angela stood firm, crossing her arms protectively over her belly. "No, now." A tense silence fell between them in the marble-floored foyer. Angela had rehearsed this confrontation dozens of times in her head, but the actual moment felt surreal. She started with the obvious, his social media posts. She demanded to know who the woman was, whether Cassie Delgado was truly just a consultant. Mark tried to dismiss it as exaggerated rumors describing Cassie as a business partner who happened to be a close friend. Yet Angela's tears and fury dissolved any illusions. She raged at him for abandoning her during the pregnancy, for flaunting a lavish lifestyle, while she dealt with swollen ankles, hormonal surges, and sleepless nights alone. Her voice rose with each accusation. She brandished printouts of Mark's social media pictures, her hands shaking violently. "You think I'm stupid? Look at how she stares at you in these pictures." Her tears glimmered in the light, but her voice stayed sharp, revealing a hidden steeliness that Mark was unprepared for. Cornered Mark tried to justify himself. He mumbled about stressful deals and complicated emotions, as though that gave him a license to betray her. Sometimes I feel trapped. Our life, it got so big, so fast. I never wanted to hurt you." But Angela's eyes, filled with betrayal, told him that any excuse would be hollow. Then came the topic Mark dreaded most: the IRS investigation. Angela slammed a folder onto a nearby coffee table containing the messages and notices she had intercepted from Mark's CFO and legal team. "I'm not a fool, Mark. What's going on with our finances? Are we in danger?" Her voice cracked, revealing not just anger, but a profound fear for the baby's future. Mark went pale. Faced with no way out, Mark finally admitted pieces of the truth, that the IRS was scrutinizing his accounts and that Caldwell was under investigation. He glossed over the details, claiming it was merely a routine check, but Angela knew better. She told him about the phone call from Kara Hoffman, the anxiety in the finance department, the hush-hush rumors swirling in business circles. Mark's casual dismissal of the audit set her on edge. She could see the worry etched in his eyes, belying his false assurances. In that painful moment, Angela realized they were standing on the precipice of something far larger than infidelity. They were at risk of losing their home, their reputations, possibly even their freedom if Mark's dealings were truly illegal. A swirl of confusion overtook her. How could the man she loved, who once saved every penny to buy her a modest engagement ring, have drifted so far into moral bankruptcy, summoning what strength she had? Left, Angela delivered an ultimatum. Either you end this affair, cooperate fully with the investigation, and prove you can be a father, or I'll leave. I won't stand by and let you drag me and our child down with you. Her tone was firm, a quiet declaration that shattered Mark's self-serving illusions. For the first time, he saw in Angela a strength more formidable than he had ever imagined. He stuttered, pleading with her to let him make it. Right, insisting that Cassie meant nothing, that he'd handle the IRS. But Angela stared at him, tears still streaming. She gave him one last chance, an opportunity to come clean and choose family over his addictive chase for wealth and excitement. Mark stood there, drenched in shame and uncertainty, uncertain if he could muster the courage to confront the monstrous problems he himself had created. The moment Mark set foot in his corner office. The next day, he felt the tension in the air so thick it could be cut with a knife. Several of his junior associates were huddled in the hallway, whispering among themselves. His CFO, Brian Cummings, appeared frazzled eyes, lined with dark circles from working through the night. A handful of boxes, filled with financial documents, stood stacked against the walls, evidence that the office had been combed through thoroughly. No sooner had Mark taken a seat behind his expansive mahogany desk than Mallory Finch, the lead auditor from the IRS, entered the room. She introduced herself politely, but her demeanor carried the authority of someone who had already unearthed serious irregularities. Mark tried to maintain his usual cool composure, but Mallory's questions were pointed. We'll need full access to your ledgers, bank statements, and any documentation related to your offshore accounts, she stated, her voice calm yet unyielding. One by one, Mark's staff delivered files to Mallory and her audit team. The entire office felt like a crime scene, with accountants and lawyers picking through every line item, every receipt and every contract. Mark attempted to project an air of cooperation, hoping that by acting transparent, he might reduce suspicion. Yet behind the facade, panic flared in his chest with each document he signed over. Over the following days, Mallory's team uncovered evidence of large sums of money flowing through shell corporations. Whenever Mark tried to feign ignorance, Mallory presented him with email correspondences or suspicious wire transfer confirmations bearing his digital signature. In meeting after meeting, Mark struggled to explain the labyrinthine structure of his business dealings. He found himself stumbling over the complexities, some of which Caldwell had orchestrated. Meanwhile, Caldwell was conspicuously absent. Phone calls to him went straight to voicemail, and cryptic text messages offered no real support. Mark finally reached Caldwell's lawyer, only to be informed that Caldwell was unavailable and that Mark should speak to his own legal counsel. Though Mark's official stance remained that he and Caldwell were partners, Caldwell had begun insulating himself from the fallout. Cassie, too, seemed suddenly distant. She had been helpful before, but once the audit gained momentum, she avoided dropping by the office or appearing with Mark publicly. She insisted it was best to keep a low profile until the situation blew over. Privately, Cassie was assessing whether Mark was worth sticking around for, or if she should jump ship to protect her burgeoning career. The glow of their sun-drenched vacations felt like a lifetime ago. Now every conversation crackled with tension. Amid the chaos, Angela received a flurry of calls from Mark's lawyers, advising her to limit any public statements or social media posts that might affect the ongoing investigation. Though she had no intention of speaking publicly, she understood the subtext. They feared she might vent her frustrations, potentially exposing more of Mark's secrets. She responded politely, but remained on guard, reluctant to trust anyone paid by Mark's questionable fortunes. But for Angela, the real challenge was emotional. She felt paralyzed, uncertain whether to believe Mark's repeated assertions that he was handling it. With each day, her baby grew inside her, a silent testament to the gravity of the life choices swirling around her. She was torn between anger, heartbreak, and the faint hope that Mark could somehow rectify the damage he'd wrought. As the audit wore on, Mark's worst fears materialized. His personal finances, those he had guarded most fiercely, were now under scrutiny. Mallory's team discovered that some of his lavish personal expenses were siphoned directly from corporate accounts. Worse, there was evidence of tax fraud, with Mark claiming deductions for luxury trips that in reality had nothing to do with legitimate business. It was the perfect storm for a case that could escalate beyond simple fines into criminal charges. In a tense meeting late one evening, Mark's legal counsel laid everything on the table. If you don't fully cooperate and provide any remaining documents, the IRS may pursue charges. You could face prison time, Mark reeled. Jail had never been part of his wildest calculations. He had assumed that being wealthy and well-connected would insulate him from serious legal consequences. Now that protective veil was disintegrating, needing a lifeline. Mark attempted to reach out to Caldwell one last time. To his shock, Caldwell's phone was answered by a cold, automated voice announcing the number had been disconnected. A follow-up call to Caldwell's office revealed that the mogul was allegedly overseas for an extended period. Mark cursed under his breath, realizing he had been left to fend for himself in a lion's den. The man who had once toasted to their partnership was now vanishing like smoke. That night, Mark sat alone in his office, the city lights glimmering through floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the scattered paperwork that spelled doom for his financial empire. He considered calling Cassie to vent or beg for comfort, but the prospect of another hollow reassurance made his stomach churn. As he stared at the final remnants of his once grandiose aspirations, a pang of regret rattled him. He had traded his wife's love and his family's future for fleeting thrills and illusions of grandeur. Now the audit threatened to expose every lie he'd told to Angela, to the world, and most damningly to himself. In the days that followed, the audit expanded, touching not only Mark's direct holdings, but also affiliated partnerships. News leaked, leading to sensational headlines. Millionaire entrepreneur under IRS probe, high-flying lifestyle meets harsh reality, and partner of Richard Caldwell, questioned in major tax evasion case. Journalists began digging into Mark's background, painting him as the poster child for new money gone awry. Every flashy social media post he'd made with Cassie became tabloid fodder. The images relabeled as evidence of possible embezzlement. His office phone rang incessantly with calls from investors, business associates, and even distant relatives who wanted their slice of the truth or an explanation of how he'd tarnished the family name. Mark's PR team scrambled to contain the fallout, spinning statements about how he was fully cooperating with authorities. But the tone was grim. and the public consensus leaned toward condemnation. People love a success story, but they find an equal or perhaps greater thrill in watching a figure stumble, especially one who had reveled in ostentatious displays of wealth. Cassie Delgado, once an ever-present source of excitement, showed up unannounced at Mark's office one evening. Her eyes darted nervously around the reception area, where agents and lawyers were busily poring over boxes of files. She slipped into Mark's private suite, shutting the door behind her with a soft click. Mark, physically and emotionally drained, looked up surprised and guarded. She spoke in a hushed tone, a tremor in her voice, betraying the panic beneath her practiced composure. "Mark, this is getting out of hand. The IRS could start looking into every transaction I handled for you. My name is on some of those marketing contracts. If they think I'm part of this..." She left the threat unspoken. Mark stared at her, half annoyed, half sympathetic. He realized she had never planned to be caught in a legal quagmire. Her loyalty was as transactional as any of his offshore ventures. In a bid to reassure her, Mark promised that her name would remain clear, insisting she hadn't knowingly committed any crimes. She demanded to see documents, emails, receipts, anything to confirm she wouldn't be implicated. Reluctantly, Mark allowed her a glimpse into some sanitized versions of his accounts. Yet the tension between them was palpable. The illusions of a carefree relationship disintegrated under the weight of potential indictments. Cassie left the office with no promise of a future rendezvous. Meanwhile, Angela found herself navigating a different battleground. Mark's lawyers pressed her to sign documents that would shield certain assets under her name, presumably to separate them from Mark's precarious financial entanglements. Confused and wary, Angela enlisted a lawyer of her own. She wasn't about to let Mark's shady dealings ruin her credit or her standing, especially with a baby on the way. "Protect yourself," her lawyer advised. "You don't want to be tied to anything that could be seized if this goes south." At night, Angela wrestled with a storm of emotions. She was furious with Mark for placing her in such a precarious position, but also worried about the father of her child potentially facing prison. Her moral dilemma festered. Should she stand by him in hopes that he'd transform back into the man she once loved? Or should she cut ties, safeguarding herself and her baby from the inevitable destruction amid this maelstrom? Mark's friend-turned-mentor, Richard Caldwell, maintained an enigmatic distance. Whispers circulated that Caldwell had fled to a non-extradition country or was in the process of shifting assets to offshore havens. A single short letter from Caldwell's legal team arrived at Mark's office, disclaiming any responsibility for Mark's financial decisions. It stated, Caldwell was prepared to cooperate with authorities if he was subpoenaed. Mark felt a chill at the underlying threat Caldwell might cut a deal that implicated him in exchange for leniency. In desperation, Mark tried to salvage at least one partnership. He invited one of his key investors, Michael Evans, a man he once considered a friend, to dinner at an upscale restaurant. The objective was to reassure Evans that the business still had potential, that Mark's personal troubles wouldn't sink their joint ventures. But over the flicker of candlelight, Evans drummed his fingers on the table and coldly remarked, "I invested in your vision. Mark, not in your vanity. Now it seems all you cared about was flaunting money you didn't even have." The meal ended early with Evans walking away, refusing to share even a parting handshake. Humiliation sank heavily into Mark's gut doors that once opened for him. Private clubs, elite investment groups were swiftly closing. Rumors and half-truths spread. People who had lauded him for his risk-taking brilliance now labeled him reckless or even criminally negligent. Each day felt like a war of attrition on his spirit, culminating in the knowledge that he had orchestrated his own downfall. In a final desperate effort, Mark turned to Angela, swallowing his pride. He arrived at the mansion late one evening, drenched by a sudden rainstorm, and found her in the living room, reading pregnancy guides by the flickering fire. Collapsing to his knees beside her, Mark pleaded for her forgiveness, promising to set everything right. He vowed to cut ties with Cassie and even threatened legal action against Caldwell, swearing he would devote himself to her and their unborn child if she would just stand by him through the audit. Angela listened with weary eyes. She wanted to believe him, yearned for the possibility of redemption. But trust is not an infinite resource. However profound her love might have been, it was battered and fragile now. "Mark," she whispered, voice trembling. "I need more than promises. I need a reason to believe you'll truly change for once." Mark had no clever comeback, no glib assurance. He simply held Angela's hands in his own, the silent tears mixing with the rainwater dripping from his hair. Yet in her mind, Angela couldn't shake the image of him, carefree on some exotic beach, while her tears stained the floors of an empty home. Whether he was truly remorseful or just desperate to avoid utter collapse, she couldn't quite discern. The inevitable moment came one crisp autumn morning. Mark received a summons detailing the IRS's intent to pursue charges of tax fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to evade taxes. Although formal indictments had not yet been filed, the document spelled out enough to shake Mark to his core. If convicted, he could face hefty fines and potentially years behind bars. News outlets pounced on the story, fueling public outrage over Mark's ostentatious lifestyle at the expense of unpaid taxes and possible illegal gains. Overnight, he became a pariah. The viral hashtag #RutherfordCoreReckoning trended across social media, accompanied by pictures from his once vaunted Instagram feed. Memes ridiculed him as a cautionary tale of greed and moral decay. As the IRS case progressed, Mark's lawyers advised him to seek a plea deal, something that might reduce jail time if he cooperated fully and revealed any co-conspirators. Mark balked at first. The mere idea of turning on Caldwell felt like a betrayal. But Caldwell had already disappeared from Mark's life, leaving a trail of plausible deniability. There was no loyalty to preserve anymore. In a tense meeting with his legal team, Mark agreed to provide detailed accounts of his transactions with Caldwell and the shady practices they had employed to mask income. It was a desperate act, akin to dragging others into the fire to lessen his own burns. Mark felt equal parts anger and shame. His once proud confidence had eroded, leaving behind a man grasping for any lifeline. Meanwhile, Angela watched from the sidelines, sickened and heartbroken. She was summoned as well, though primarily as a witness. Her name was on certain joint bank accounts. Her baby bump had grown. Each kick reminded her of the new life she was trying to protect. She prepared herself to testify, truthfully determined not to lie for Mark. If he had ever truly loved her, he wouldn't force her into the role of accomplice. Cassie Delgado, too, was called for questioning. While her official work for Mark's firm was deemed legitimate, investigators wanted to ensure she wasn't complicit in any financial crimes. Terrified of criminal charges, Cassie painted herself as merely an employee, someone who had no role in Mark's financial decisions. She cooperated, answering every question about Mark's whereabouts, his corporate spending, and how business expenses often appeared suspiciously personal in nature. With her personal involvement clarified, Cassie walked away unscathed, albeit her reputation irreparably tarnished. The final blow to Mark's empire came with a court-ordered freeze on many of his assets. His mansion went into foreclosure, luxury cars were repossessed, and his bank accounts were seized, pending further legal proceedings. One by one, employees in his companies were laid off, fueling bitter resentment from families who relied on those paychecks. Mark couldn't meet payroll or vendor obligations. He watched helplessly as everything he'd built, the offices, the brand, the illusions, crumbled. Angela made the difficult decision to move out of the mansion before the bank officially reclaimed it. She refused Mark's tearful requests to stay by his side, insisting they needed space to reflect. She settled temporarily in a modest apartment near her parents, choosing to focus on her well-being and the baby's imminent arrival. Her lawyer had successfully shielded her personal finances, ensuring she wouldn't be dragged into Mark's legal vortex. On the day Mark finally accepted the plea agreement, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, cameras flashed. As he walked in, his hair unkempt, dark circles under his eyes. The same man who once strutted in designer suits now wore a resigned expression and an off-the-rack outfit. In front of a judge, he spoke words he never envisioned uttering. "I plead guilty, Your Honor." The plea involved cooperating with ongoing investigations into Caldwell's network, offering testimony regarding their underhanded financial schemes. Though prison time was nearly certain, it might be lessened due to his cooperation. Standing in that courtroom, Mark felt a nauseating swirl of regret. He flashed back to simpler times, when a faithful wife, a small apartment, and a dream for a better life had been enough. How far he had strayed. Walking out to a chorus of shouted questions from journalists, Mark said nothing. His lawyer shielded him, guiding him into a waiting car. As they pulled away, he glimpsed a billboard on a nearby building. It displayed a gleaming tropical scene, with a couple laughing on a beach, a seductive advertisement for holiday packages. He closed his eyes, remembering his social media posts with Cassie under exactly such a sun. The irony was as bitter as the metallic taste of fear and regret on his tongue. In the ensuing weeks, Mark prepared for sentencing. The judge would weigh his cooperation against the severity of his crimes. He resided in a small, barren apartment, a far cry from his former luxury. The silence at night was deafening, and sleep evaded him. He alternated between making calls to his remaining legal counsel and drafting letters of apology to employees, to business partners, and most painfully to Angela. While Mark grappled with his new reality, Angela focused on hers. She continued prenatal checkups, often accompanied by her supportive mother. Away from the oppressive gloom of Mark's downfall, Angela found moments of calm, even happiness. She set up a simple nursery in her parents' home, painting the walls a gentle shade of yellow. As she folded tiny baby clothes, she felt a blend of apprehension and resolve. The future was uncertain, but she would not let Mark's mistakes define her child's life. As Mark approached his sentencing date, he met again with Mallory Finch, the steadfast IRS auditor who had spearheaded the case. Despite her unwavering professionalism, Mallory sensed the tragic undertones of Mark's journey. She had encountered dozens of wealthy individuals who believed themselves untouchable, but Mark's downfall seemed particularly steep. When Mark thanked her, an odd moment of gratitude to the person who had effectively unraveled his life, Mallory simply responded, "I hope this leads you to a better path." On a chilly winter afternoon, Angela went into labor, surrounded by her mother, her sister, and a compassionate medical staff. She brought a healthy baby boy into the world. She named him Daniel, honoring her grandfather. As she held her son for the first time, tears rolled down her cheeks. This was a new beginning, fragile, beautiful, and untainted by the sins of the father. Mark, informed by letter, received the news in his prison cell. He felt a pang of both joy and sorrow, imagining the life he could have shared with them, if only he hadn't succumbed to greed and self-indulgence. Restricted by concrete walls and razor wire, he could only dream of a day he might hold his child. He resolved that if he ever got the chance, he would be a better man. This real-life drama story of grandiose wealth, crushing betrayal, and hard-earned redemption reminds us that no amount of luxury can outweigh the value of loyalty and honesty. Mark Rutherford's rise and fall echo a stark warning beneath every glittering facade. Lie choices that can shatter families and futures if we allow greed to eclipse our moral compass. Angela's journey underlines the power of inner strength. By choosing integrity over complicity, she protected not just herself, but the next generation.